So, welcome to this edition of Tomorrow's Historians. I'm not going to take you through the background, it's in your program. I always felt that people coming to an event are intelligent enough to read the program, and then it becomes redundant if I announce what all that is. So, it's there, the history here. It's been about 12 years, I believe, 13 years maybe, since this program was started. Dr. Weiselberg, of course, all of you guys know, was really instrumental in starting that. A little bit about myself. I was lucky enough to spend my career here at Irvington. And there's a line, I've seen it a number of times, but it was reinforced the other day between you think you still have a foot here, and then the other side of that is your historical. Kind of current historical. And I knew when my son Skylar, who's a teacher here, started sending me the papers that had been sent to him, because he's Mr. Rosenthal, and they were supposed to come to me, and they were just put on the email. Like, who's that guy? I know the guy who teaches biology on the second floor, so that just kind of confirmed the historical part where I am at this moment. But so it's really an honor for me to be here and be part of this. And so let me start off with a couple of notes and thanks and congratulations. First, I want to thank the parents for being here. If you're a parent or a relative, your hand goes up. Yeah, outstanding. Yeah. There's a reason these guys are all here, and many reasons they're all here, and you're a part of that, obviously. So I want to thank you really much for not only being here tonight, but being part of inspiring them to be great students. And as far as the students go, first I just heard say creme de la creme, and that's really what we have here tonight. I think of so many outstanding programs this school has. And whether it's athletics or music or the science research, this is, if you take the history program, this is at the pinnacle right here, what you're going to be doing tonight, sharing tonight. So congratulations. It's really an honor for you to be here and to be recognized. I thought of a quote, I didn't think of it, but I actually looked it up, by H.G. Wells when I was thinking about something that might apply to this group. And to quote, "Human history becomes more and more a race between education and catastrophe." Between education and catastrophe. And here are educators. Here are educators. So thank goodness they're in the race. They're moving the baton forward on the winning, hopefully the winning team. And you folks too, with your intelligence, your passion, your curiosity towards history. Put you on, for my money, the right side of the right team as well, so thank you for that. I want to thank the Irvington Historical Society. We have several members here tonight, and I'll start off with our president, Veronica Gedrich. Take her hand, she's always pushing members to do things and find things to present to the community. It's a full-time job as far as I can see with all the things that she does. And Veronica, I think you maybe want to say a few words at the end of encouragement. Yeah, okay. She follows every program with really what's coming up and encouraging folks to tie into some of our programs. We're also lucky enough tonight to have Pat and John Ryan, the program which just arrived 2 minutes on time. I was getting a little nervous because Chris was making me nervous about it. I just go up and read it off your email, and I said, I don't want to do that. My phone's in the car. As soon as that happened, Pat Ryan walks in. Here are the programs. Here are the certificates. And that's that's not a surprise, because that's what Pat does. She just is saving people right and left, as far as myself included. She's a go-to person with anything in Irvington historical. She's a past president. She and John are institutions in this community. In fact, there's a Pat and John Ryan Scholarship, which we presented at the Senior Awards Dinner, in honor of them and what they've done. So I want a round of applause for Pat and John. And a couple other members here who are also instrumental in making things happen. Sarah Kelsey is in the back row. She's actually one of the program chairs that put on events every month, which I would encourage you to. It's on our website. The events are fairly just about every month. And she and her colleague, Pat Bonamy, I think Sarah might be on her way here. She comes down from Cape Cod every year for this. And there's really no reason for her to come back to Irvington. She spends the summers in Cape Cod. But she comes back for this because she's about 96 years old. And just a legendary historian. numerous books, professor emeritus at NYU. I mean, she's the real deal. She, I think, that spirit infuses a lot of us as members because she just is energetic, plays tennis, does skis. And part of it's just her curiosity and her love of knowledge. In fact, she's writing a book currently. So she may walk in and do also stop just to introduce her because she's that special. But thankfully, Chet Kerr's here as well, standing in the back. He's really been a guiding force behind us. If you go to the website, you will see just all kinds of programs that he's put on. And he's the guy, if you ever write to the Irvington Historical Society, say, hey, I live on, South Buckout Street. Can you tell me a little bit about the history of my house? I get the email because that's one of my jobs, this big. And then I send it to Chet, and then it goes this big, as far as doing the research of the history. And he just does it within a day. He's got this dissertation on the house from the time the first brick went into the thing to its current use. So, not that I'm encouraging you to find out about your house in your future. I think he's got plenty to do, but down the road, if you're interested, he's the guy you want to go to. Chet, I want to thank you for being here. John Nelson, also a member of our Historical Society. She's the reason that the outside of that historical McVicker house looks so great. She's there on the weekends or whatnot, picking weeds and clipping bushes and doing everything she can to make the place look presentable. If you haven't been to the McVicker house, hopefully that's not a strange term to you, but hopefully you'll find the time to go visit it at some point. It's right on Main Street, second block on the right as you drive down, right near the Main Street School. And there are yearly exhibits there and just great stuff about Irvington history. Okay, next thank you goes to Chris and Larry Fata. It's interesting. You would think that when you have a situation where two people are going at it pretty good and making fun of each other and trying to encourage certain students to attend their class, not the other guy's class. Because my gosh, why do you want to go to his class? Well, he says one thing, he says the other. But clearly, history has a capability of bringing people together, shared passion, shared love. And fortunately for this project, they actually talk to each other and figure things out so that we can have the program. But I want to thank them for their time and effort helping pull us together. Chris in particular, this is probably the busiest time of year for him. You guys all know AP exam, the training, the stuff that goes into getting you ready for that. How many went to Gettysburg? Okay. Yeah, rumor has it the number's up to like 585 people at this point. Kids from other schools are kind of hijacking our buses and jump on. But just a major undertaking. And you know it's a great trip, and I've been on it a couple times. It's amazing. You know it's a great trip when chaperones actually sign up to go on a field trip, which starts at 6 a.m. in the morning, and you get home at some, godforsaken 11:30 at night. But it's because of what he does for that trip.
10:55.
So I really want to thank him. He's really picked up after Dr. Weiselberg got out, and he's picked up the torch and carried it forward. So I really want to thank him. He deserves a round of applause. All right, and then finally, I have two other folks here tonight. I want to thank our filmmakers. We've got Rem on the camera over here, and we've got Elliot over here. I just want to shout out for my friend Elliot here. I've gotten to know him the last couple of years, and you all, I think, have hopefully seen some of his videos. They are so good. They've been posted on our website because he's interested in history. He's interested in film, but he's also interested in history, and he's just been delightful. He's filmed a number of things for us. He's going to have a great career. I keep telling myself to get his autograph because it's going to be too late. He's going to be walking down the red carpet at the Oscars some night, and I'm going to say, why didn't I get his autograph? He's that talented. So I thank you two guys for being here tonight. It's really a pleasure. Speaking of videos, this will be on the website in a week or so. If there's something that missed that you want to go back and see or send it to a relative or whatever, or have them check in, I'd encourage you to have them take a look at that. I think I'm finished. No, last thing, format. So what's going to happen, these guys in your program, they're the first part, there's a theme, the three themes. They will speak for a couple of minutes about each of their papers. They will entertain any questions you might have. We will then take a break after they've finished, and then the next group will come. So we'll do that 3 times. And again, open to questions or whatnot. I think you're going to walk away just amazed at the depth, the quality of work that they've done, and also the variety of interests they have. one of the really great things about this paper is that they choose what they want to do. And a number of schools, okay, here's our topic, dive in. Well, number one, I think it keeps them interested is grading the papers, because they have to read the same essay, 55 times, 95 times. But it also just speaks very highly about what curious kids, students they are, and the things they're really passionate about. And you're going to hear a lot of that tonight. So sit back, relax, enjoy. Coach Bear, I'm going to turn it over. No, John, would you like to say that? John,
Yeah, so, well, thanks everybody for being here. For those who I haven't met, my name is John Hirsch. I'm the principal now. You're seeing whatever levels of success I've achieved in 2 years here, you're seeing part of the secret, which is stand on the shoulders of Rosenthal and don't mess it up. At any rate, so thank you for that incredible framing. I'll just say quickly, looking at this program, I would, even my workers would come, just because I think this is so interesting. And I think, what's the role of historians? It's to look back and sort of discover, well, who were we, so we might better understand who we are, and we represent the opposite to who we'll become. And I think I'm looking forward to hearing that. Looking at this title, I think that's exactly what we've done. And I want to echo the thanks to the teachers, the department, who have given me this opportunity to do the real work. And through your work, we're going to learn more about our town, our world, ourselves, but also you. It's your voice that are sort of framing for us. So thank you guys for bringing us together. Thank everybody else for coming. And thank Mr. Barrett, Mr. Fata, and Mr. Rosenthal. Thank you.
So just a little bit more, sorry to add on, but at the end of the program, you will receive a certificate from the Irvington Historical Society for your great research. So make sure you get that. And just to tweak in terms of how it's going to work, we'll start with each of you introducing yourself, again saying what your favorite topic was, and then spending a minute or so talking about what you found, what your big observations or outcomes were in terms of your research. And then I think I'll pose a couple of questions to start for the group, and then you feel free to chime in as you want. Please use the microphones, so it'll help especially with the film. And once I'm done with my couple of questions, we'll open it up to the audience, and definitely highly encourage you to chime in with any questions, because I think that makes it go even better. The last thing I'll say, a lot of shout-outs. I just want to reiterate one more time a shout-out to Dr. Weiselberg, who really came up with this whole format, and he really was a master. I feel like I may be struggling to follow in his shoes, but those of you that go back ways enough to know when Erik did it, it really, I agree with what Dr. Moe said. It's one of the best things we do. Obviously, as the teacher of most of these, or many of these students, and Mr. Fata would say the same thing. Just makes us really proud that we have students that are capable of achieving at this level. But I know Dr. W. really created this whole thing. And then the last thing I'll say, this is the Peter Oley, tomorrow's Historian Symposium. I was lucky enough to work with Mr. Oley Coach Oley for 7 years when I first got here. Not only was he the village historian and a towering figure, he also established the tremendous track and cross-country program we have here, which I was lucky enough to inherit. And I always like to just give him a shout out because I know he cared deeply about local history and about education and about Irvington education in particular, and I know he would just be thrilled that we're still doing this all these years later, so I want to give him a shout out as well. So again, we'll start with you guys introduce yourself, start with Mohan, and then tell us what your paper title was and what you found in your research, and then we'll go down the line.
I'm Mohan Desai, and my topic was the socioeconomic and white superiority underpinnings of Japanese American internment camps during World War II. And I think I've had one of the main takeaways I found was that the U.S. government was or at least the white population in the U.S. was very keen on oppressing Japanese Americans who they were a succeeding minority group, and yes, they did face struggles like a lot of other minority groups during that time, but they found a role in the American society in the early 1900s, and the U.S. government, coupled with white agriculturalist organizations, racist organizations, they sought to oppress them, and this paved the way for Franklin Roosevelt to, vanquish them into internment camps for no justifiable reason. And then after camps, yes, they did succeed. They eventually did succeed, and they became a very successful minority group in the U.S., but it came at the cost of racial trauma and very difficulties right after they left the camp. And then I think it was very interesting to do this topic because we talk a lot about African American segregation and stuff like that, and that's very important to learn about. But I think this topic, the cause and effects of Japanese internment, it's not really talked about as much in American history, and it's just very interesting to compare that to Jim Crow, for example, in the South, and stuff like that. And a couple of days ago, I was in Atlanta, and I got to see Martin Luther King's, tomb and museum, and I think it really exposed me to how the U.S. is still a segregated society today, and there's a lot of inequality, and stuff like that. And I think it goes to show that systemic oppression is a very real thing in the U.S., and nothing is almost impossible to solve it, because once you're systemically oppressed, it's a vicious cycle.
Hello, my name is Scott Zinman, and my paper was titled Game Changers and the Empowering Influence of Black Athletes on the Civil Rights Movement. And my thesis was that black athletes, specifically my paper focused on Jackie Robinson, Bill Russell, and Muhammad Ali, how they used their fame as a call for action to insist on racial equality for all African Americans. And one of the key takeaways that I found was that each of these athletes although they used different tactics, they recognized the power of their platform, and they utilized that in order to speak out against racial injustices and to better the civil rights for Black Americans. And specifically, I found that Jackie Robinson and Bill Russell took more calculated and reserved approaches when it came to calling for change. However, Muhammad Ali took more violent or more confrontational and outspoken approaches when calling for change. And these athletes also inspired more current day athletes, such as Colin Kaepernick of the San Francisco 49ers, who took a stance during the national anthem, and it's a continuous movement that still endures to present day.
Good evening. I'm Massimo Ferrari, and my research was based on the limited interventions of the United States during the outset of World War II with Jewish immigration out of Europe. And I was driven by the lessons that we had in class, but based on my family's past, and I had immigrants come out of Europe, I was really inspired and driven to look more into this topic. So what I took out of my research and several interviews with immigrants, some Jewish, some Italian, was that contrary to common notion, the United States really had a limited impact on helping the Jews escape their terrible situation in Europe. I learned that the United States rather focused on defeating the German army and deciding not to destroy German railroads, which further contributed to the damage within the Jewish populations, as they were kind of forced to just stay in concentration camps within Europe. And another example of this would be the ship of the St. Louis, which had negative impacts on the Jewish population since the very strict and immigration policies that the United States had employed during this time. They were forced to go back to Europe, and unfortunately many of the occupants of that ship unfortunately died to the Holocaust. So my main takeaway was that the United States could have done so much more, even besides the establishment of Israel in 1948. They had so many more opportunities to help the Jews escape, but instead decided not to do it and focus on themselves instead.
Hi, my name is Minori Furtado. My paper was about the cultural movement started in Hawaii by Native Hawaiians from the 1960s around to the 1990s, and the island, specifically the island Ka'olave, which was reclaimed and used as a goal by this group of ethnic Hawaiians. So from the early 20th century on, Hawaiian culture became very popular in the mainland, specifically used in things like vaudeville shows, and island songs became very popular. You can think of probably many famous films of Golden Hollywood that include sort of references to Hawaiian culture or tropical exotic culture. In this time, the 1960s, grassroots movements and a lot of racial movements were started. You can think of the Civil Rights Movement, you can think of the Native American AIM movement, and at the same time, Hawaiian artists and cultural activists, politicians, and musicians especially, all banded together to reclaim their ethnic Hawaiian heritage and what's known as the Second Hawaiian Renaissance. At the same time, the island of Ka'olave was occupied by the Navy after the World Wars and throughout the Cold War, used for bombing and target practice. And this group of Native Hawaiians took the island, and it became sort of a symbol of their newfound power in their own heritage. And they created a movement to reclaim the island for the Native Hawaiian people, which they eventually won in the 1990s after movements of protests, many songs, tragedy of a few missing musicians. But overall, they eventually reclaimed the island and helped restore it after years and years of bombing. It shows that the power of music and art can really connect people, and a grassroots movement started from a contained place such as Hawaii can really band together and create actual political and environmental change.
Hi, my name is Catherine Halley. In my paper, I covered the inaccurate legacy of Mexican immigration. And so throughout my paper, I really wanted to investigate the continuities and the changes of how Mexicans, and specifically Mexican immigrants, have been represented in our media and in our government. And so specifically, I covered the Great Depression, World War II, and modern day. And what I found was that throughout history, Mexicans have been falsely represented as, specifically in the Great Depression, as stealing jobs from real Americans, and there was actually lots of government programs initiated during the Great Depression to repatriate Mexican immigrants, even those who were there legally. And there was a variety of riots. The most famous one that I researched was the La Plaza riot, where Mexican immigrants, whether they were there documented or undocumented, were sent back to Mexico in Los Angeles. Just completely unprecedented. There was no real cause for the riot, there was no violence. It was just from the police being ordered to go and force Mexicans back to Mexico. And so I also covered the Zoot Suit riots during World War II, which basically showed how stereotypes against Mexicans had been used to criminalize Mexicans, even if they were documented or undocumented, as that had been also in the Great Depression. And so the Zoot Suits were a common form of fashion that many Mexicans would wear, specifically again in Los Angeles. And what happened was it just came to a height, tensions in Los Angeles, and many Mexicans were killed by army members and just anyone, and a lot of Mexicans were killed, including people that weren't Mexican, like Asians, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, and it just came down to white people using negative racist stereotypes to target minorities. And finally, I investigated modern day, and I focused more on New York and the recent influx of Mexican immigrants that have come to New York City, and the stereotype that with an influx of specifically Mexican immigrants comes lots of crime, which is not supported by any data, but has been circulated by our former president and by the media, and is just not accurate. And so in all, I just found that throughout our history, Mexican immigrants and Mexicans in general have been falsely represented by our government and by the media and have suffered greatly because of it.
Hi, I'm Michelle Zoe, and I researched the eugenics movement and the Tuskegee Civil Study. So in the post-Civil War era, African Americans and other minority groups continued to face discrimination in the scientific world through two movements. So one of them was the eugenics movement, which basically forced sterilization on over 60,000 people in the United States, and the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, which was caused and created by eugenics leaders. So the eugenics movement was based off of the social Darwinism, which was based off of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, which basically said that the fit were the rich people, and these people were more fit for society and would be able to reproduce better, I guess. And the unfit were the poor people and the mentally disabled. So eugenics leaders applied social Darwinism to their claims that the unfit should not be able to reproduce and produce offspring that would be unfit. So they used this false science to back up their claim and forcibly sterilize over 60,000 minority groups. Most of them were Asian Americans, African Americans, or those who had mental issues or like disabilities, and these were not hereditary. However, the eugenics leaders believed in this false science in order to forcibly sterilize these people. And the Tuskegee Syphilis Study was led by these eugenics leaders, and this was a study in Macon County, Alabama, which offered treatment to 600 African Americans for syphilis, which is a type of sexually transmitted disease. And they believed that African Americans were more prone to this disease due to their insatiable sexual appetites, which is very stereotypical and completely untrue. So eugenics leaders claimed they were treating African Americans for syphilis when they were actually giving them ineffective treatments. So this led to the deaths of many of the people who participated in the study. And right now, as a result, there are widened disparities for healthcare for African Americans, and it also led to distrust in the healthcare system of the United States.
Hello, my name is Alyssa Wong, and the title of my research was Chinese Immigrants Rushed into the California Gold Mines, a period of Chinese exploitation and systemic racism. And my thesis was that despite the labor contributions made to the gold rush, Chinese immigrants workers were subjected to systemic discrimination and violence as shown by exclusion acts, massacres, and medical exploitation. And for my findings, I found this very interesting. So where this racism really stemmed from, it was less of whites feeling superior. In fact, they actually were the people who sort of became that pull factor for Chinese to come, because they knew that the Chinese had experience working in gold mines in, for example, Guangdong. And they wanted their labor, but as the Chinese started working and it became more popular, they found that many white miners saw the Chinese as labor competitors, and this is because Chinese were very diligent workers and patient, so they would work in mines that many of the other miners didn't want to. They would work longer hours, and they would accept a lower pay. so many other white miners were getting put out of their work because they wanted the Chinese instead. And this resulted in various forms of mistreatment. So they tried to have the Chinese stop immigrating. So first they would have higher taxes. So this was a tax only just for Chinese, where they had to pay around like $20 to now would be around like $20 per month. Oh, sorry, that's $6.50 a month now, and it's $20 back then. And they increased these types of exclusions through the Exclusion Act, where they would prohibit the Chinese from, if they were to leave the country, they couldn't come back for, it was like 10 years, but it became more severe when they weren't allowed to come back at all. And this was also followed by different mass murders, where it didn't even stem from them being like minority, but they saw it was initially a internal issue between Chinese, and some whites tried to put down the fight, but it became a catalyst for the whites' anti-Chinese sentiments to come out. So this is where a lot of lynchings and like murders happened, and showing all the different students because of the way they didn't want the Chinese working.
Thanks. So my first question really comes out of, as I'm listening to really all of you, but certainly several of you, concerns like systemic oppression or systemic racism. Catherine, you made me think about this when you were talking about what you studied. Is it circular? Are we like doomed to repeat ourselves again and again? Or do we feel like from your research that we see signs that progress is being made?
So in my research, I found that racism continued through a different lens. So before the Civil War, African Americans were enslaved, and that's obviously like a social and political racism. But after the Civil War, there was an example through my research, which was scientific continuation of racism. So through my research, it doesn't prove that it's ending, and it's actually still circular. I believe that it's still existing.
Yeah, I agree with Michelle. I think racism is still definitely like very apparent, but it's just changing in different ways. For example, in terms of my research, as COVID-19 is very prevalent still, like the anti-Chinese sentiment that proves that, it shows that like continuity.
I would say like racism's definitely like evolved, and it's more subtle now than it used to be. Like in like my research, there's literally there's the anti-Asiatic Asiatic Exclusion League, which was a prominent anti-Japanese group that sought to bar their immigration to the U.S. because they're really good at agriculture. So this was more of an apparent form of racism. But I'd say today there's definitely for example you see people in rural America, they're concerned about job security and immigrants taking their jobs. They don't paint it like that, but it's definitely similar to this Asiatic Exclusion League or another group, the Grow or Sugar Vegetable Organization, which were also eager to acquire Japanese-held farmland. So yeah, I'd say racism today is more subtle than what it used to be.
I would say in some ways it's definitely more subtle, but my research proves that because of the advancement of technology and the spread of media throughout the world, it's actually grown and it's become more unprecedented than it has in the past.
Thanks. So my next question, is there, I'm thinking about minority, not maybe all of you chime in, but is there any sort of special sauce for oppressed groups or minorities or people who have been subject to colonialism and oppression that way? Is there any sort of secret for them to be able to push back and reassert their culture, reassert their autonomy? Or is it just unique to each particular situation?
I would say that there's definitely a sauce, I guess, as you put it. I think that sauce though does have to do with the historical roots of it, like an individual culture, people. I mean, you see the trend often, especially in, revolutions or, cultural renaissances such as this, where one starts and then all of a sudden all these other ones pop up after as inspiration, which I think is a key part of it, just the, once one starts, like they really begin to blossom as everyone takes inspiration and sees sort of the effects. The Hawaiians in the 60s were inspired by the Maori, they were inspired by the Native Americans, and obviously, the youth in terms of Vietnam, and of course the civil rights movement. So that's one big example of that. But also it's very culture specific. I mean, Hawaiian culture was specifically about taking back their music and their language and their art, visual art, and their dance. Whereas, more specifically for other cultures, it's about faith and it's about land. I think that's part of it, just realizing what is unique about your own culture.
I think that secret sauce starts with the prominent and iconic figures for a certain group of people. So for example, like my research focused on Jackie Robinson and these prominent athletes, so they spark the movement, which then triggers the rest of the population to take action. So for example, Muhammad Ali's influence extended to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which got students and younger populations involved in fighting for the civil rights of Black Americans. And we also, in class, watched a documentary entitled The Eyes on the Prize, that focused on figures such as Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and inspired the rest of the population, to take action. And when their deaths occurred, that took a tremendous toll on the population, and it sparked change in people to bold and take action, and to question their circumstances in America.
I'm going to turn it over to the audience. Anybody have any questions for either the panel or anybody in particular?
I would just love to hear what sparked, you could have chosen anything, so what sparked these particular areas of interest for you?
I can say for myself, definitely. I am Hawaiian, my dad grew up in Hawaii, and his whole family did. So that's just a really, sort of personal aspect of my life and my heritage. It's often spoken about, I guess, more often spoken about in American history, about sort of when the colonization of Hawaii occurred, and when those aspects of their tradition were taken away, but not as often spoken about when they were given back, just because it's overshadowed by all those other cultural movements that occurred at the same time. So to me, it was just really important to highlight that.
Similarly, my great-grandparents both immigrated here from Mexico in 1928, so it was a time period that I had heard stories from my mom and from my grandmother that it was really interesting for me to research and see kind of what my family had to deal with throughout those time periods.
So I'm interested in medicine, and I wanted to research medical malpractices and mistreatments overall in history. So I actually went on the ChatGPT and I asked it which topics were really good for English, and genetics was a necessity.
Similar to Minori, my parents are also little Chinese, and I remember learning in class about the Transcontinental Railroad and racism and stuff in Chinese there, so it's a very similar topic, and I looked into it for a little bit.
Well, I'm not Japanese. I don't kind of lucky station, but I am interested in World War II, and we didn't, unfortunately, because of the AP exam, we didn't get to cover it like really at all. So I guess I wanted to learn more about some interesting aspects about World War II, and something I just realized also is that I found it very interesting also like to explore how like the U.S. was very hypocritical in their racial policies while they were trying to defeat like Nazi Germany, who's like trying to exterminate like literally a race of people. So I thought that hypocrisy was kind of interesting.
I chose to research my topic because I was interested in, I've always heard the name Jackie Robinson and Muhammad Ali, but I never really knew what they actually did to help better their conditions, so I wanted to learn more into what their role played in the civil rights movement, as well as I wanted to focus on learn about other athletes such as Bill Russell, who isn't talked about as much or widely known for his efforts in civil rights movement.
Yeah, as I said, I feel like a lot of this research really stemmed from the lessons in class and my desire to learn a lot more about this story, because previously, like, I've heard a lot about the immigration of Jews into the United States, but I was really I didn't know much about it, and I was really just motivated to want to learn more about it.
Anybody else from the audience?
I'd love to give it up for this fantastic.
Give a special shout out to Michelle for giving an example of appropriate use of check. So, Mr. Hirsch will give you, if you don't mind coming out this way, Mr. Hirsch will give you your certificates. So at this point, we'll ask the second group of students to come up. And our second group is mostly concerned with American foreign policy. Start on this side, and go ahead and introduce yourself and talk about your paper and also what you found.
My name is Oliver Sack, and I wrote about the causes of the Iraq War. What I found is that the Iraq War was caused primarily, the root cause of the Iraq War was the decision was the neoconservative movement that aimed to advocate for an invasion of Iraq far before the 9/11 attacks, far before basically anything that led up to the actual invasion of Iraq. During the Gulf War, they wanted George H.W. Bush to invade Iraq fully and effectively finish the job. And after the 9/11 attacks, this movement, which still held a lot of influence, effectively persuaded the Bush administration to invade Iraq without there being any actual evidence. And in order to justify this, the Bush administration tried to prove claims of weapons of mass destruction, which were false. And in attempting to prove it, they used incredibly shady and occasionally downright false evidence in order to justify it. And in the fallout from the invasion and the false causes, it led to the deterioration of U.S. trust worldwide.
Well, I'm Nathan Fensterstock, and I studied modern space exploration and how it intersects with geopolitics and America as it interacts with countries of the world sphere. Now, over the past maybe 75 years or so, well, really at World War II, America kind of rose, it became dominant on the world sphere. But over that time, I feel that its people, they're very divided and don't really have a unified purpose. They become they become very disillusioned with America as it is on the world sphere. And I believe the way to fix this is for the United States to assert itself as a leader in space. Now, what I mean by space is not necessarily Mars. I think it could be good for show. I think it could have some people as part of the NASA and whatever go to Mars. It could be like a new Antarctica for science. But the real work, the real colonization has to be done on the moon. Because if corporations and governments do not see immediate short-term benefits, they will lose interest, the motives, the momentum will be gone, and the moon provides much of that. Now, a lot of people think that space is just something that rich CEOs do. They want to go to space, escape from the world, build their egos. But if people go to the moon and use the helium-3 isotopes that are there to support the research on fusion technology, if we use the lunar resources, if we use the uranium, the deposits of calcium, iron, and all the other rare earth materials that are on the moon, we'll be able to provide corporations with a monetary incentive to go there. We'll be able to benefit the American economy very much and provide the American people with a unified incentive to operate in the world sphere. And there are other countries which a lot of people in our government are afraid of right now, like China. They've done some very impressive things in space, actually. Their Tiangong space station, that means Heavenly Palace, by the way, has been a very good example of an advanced 21st century station. They've sent multiple probes and landers to the moon. They've sent missions to Mars. We sent our Perseverance rover to Mars in 2020. They sent a lander, a rover, and an orbiter to Mars. So what we need to do is to kind of unify our allies. Japan, India, they recently sent Chandrayaan-3 to the moon, so that's good. And if we lead the world in that regard, we'll be able to do great things. And just to summarize this, really, there's a lot of issues that are holding us back right now in America. There's the environmentalism, there's inequality. We have to provide people with a reason to. We have to help our economy. And an issue that will provide us an actual unified purpose in this all is going to the moon and beginning what will eventually be expansion. So, yeah.
My name is Weiselberg, and my project is about the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb, how it was created, and what its use meant for American foreign policy during and after World War II. So it talks about how the atomic bomb was actually not necessary to be deployed to win the war against Japan, because Japan's navy had been obliterated during the course of the war. It also talks about how the creation of the atomic bomb and the political mishandling of it by Presidents Roosevelt and Truman created tension in the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, which was one of the major factors of the Cold War. So during this paper, in the research process, I learned a lot about how there was a lot of how all the scientists contributed to building this bomb, and how the Americans actually built the bomb in a race against the Germans, who had originally began working on the bomb in 1938 before the Americans did. So the Americans had to beat the Germans, and that the United States decided to share their nuclear secrets with their ally Britain, but not with their other ally, the Soviet Union at the time. And this created tension and fear in the Soviet Union that America would use the bomb against the Soviets. The Soviets also had spies in this Manhattan Project that they would use to build their own bomb, increasing tensions between the
Hi, my name's Olivia. Hi, my name's Olivia Liu, and my topic was Chinese involvement in the civil rights movement and how they forged an identity through this. So my paper kind of went in chronological order. So I started off by talking about how Chinese men came to America because of the Opium Wars. And when they were in America, they weren't really welcomed. There were a lot of laws limiting what they could do, limiting their culture, limiting the amount of money they could make. And on top of that, the government installed this, enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. And like Alyssa mentioned before, this made it really difficult for the Chinese in America because one, they couldn't, if they went back to China, they couldn't come back for another 10 years. And so this forced Chinese people to make communities in America. This was called like Chinatowns, for example, the one in the city. And eventually this was repealed in 1943. However, more quotas were installed to limit the influence of Chinese Americans. So now, or back then, only around 105 Chinese people could come into America, so that was really restricting on their ability. So around 1960s, the civil rights movement started to arise, and so Chinese or other Asian American groups started to band together to fight for their rights. So the Chinese saw this, mainly university students in California, and they started to band together to fight for their rights. And though they did do riots, I mainly focused on other aspects of how they try to fight for their freedom, such as literature, art, music. There was this main place called the Yellow Pearl that published Asian music, literature, and art. And essentially, this movement established the identity in America. And in the future now, I interviewed my grandma for this project, and she talked about how now, because of this movement, she's able to be a leader in her community. She's the leader in the Westchester Association for Chinese Americans, and she's just able to lead all these people because of what this movement has done. So that was my proposed project.
Hello, I'm Jessica Newman, and my paper dives into the causes and effects of the Red Scare of 1920. And I discovered that following World War I, empowered by extreme nationalism and patriotism, national economic instability, and radical ideologies, came the Red Scare of 1920, which led to many civic injustices. It promoted apprehension and hatred within American citizens, and it reconstructed numerous aspects of American society. So during this period, what we see is powerful figures in our society being able to convince wide masses of people to fear certain groups of people. And while they might have had certain reasons for concern within these people, for example, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, big institutions such as the press and other governing bodies took what was going on in other places in the world to instill fear in these people within Americans, usually for their own benefits and to run on their own campaigns. And this period of time severely oppressed different immigrant groups, and it proved that the lives of immigrants through many different systems in America were much harder, and it was much harder for them to achieve success and what we know as the American dream. And what I found very interesting is that from a very young age, I think many are instilled this idea that America is this great melting pot, and my paper challenges this idea and proves that that title of a melting pot is very misleading, as it shows the reality of what happens when different people that aren't like white Americans or people that are considered okay in America, it shows that their lives is nothing but smooth, and it's they live very different lives and America.
Hi, my name is Scarlett Zumbro, and for my paper I studied the moral implications of Operation Paperclip. And for those of you who don't know, Operation Paperclip started towards the end of World War II and it continued until the 60s. And it was an operation where the US government secretly brought in ex-Nazis to the US, Nazi scientists, many of whom were war criminals, and offered them safe haven in exchange for their technological know-how. And in doing this research, I found it difficult at first to take a stance because on the surface, Operation Paperclip was definitely a success. And the technologies and the just general know-how that the scientists brought over, such as the V-2 rocket, allowed us to launch a man onto the moon and supported most of our initial NASA operations. And if you just look at that side of the story, one could conclude that Operation Paperclip was a good idea and it helped us sort of win the space race. But on the flip side, once I started doing my research, I sort of found that the very idea of Operation Paperclip has very large moral implications, because bringing war criminals to the US is obviously not okay. And that could be excused if the moral failings stopped there, but they didn't. The US government evaded immigration laws and hid these scientists away from other people in the government to try and get them visas and hide them so that they didn't have to go through the general procedures. And they also created an environment where Nazi scientists could continue to conduct similar experiments that they conducted in Nazi Germany. For example, they used gas rooms again, gas chambers, and they used unwitting participants and exposed them to toxic gases like mustard gas and sarin is one of the gases. And furthermore, there was just a lot of corruption within the government. Each branch of the government didn't know what other branches of the government were doing, and this was done on purpose so that Operation Paperclip could be kept very secret and no one really knew the whole story. So after doing my research, I concluded that the success of Operation Paperclip is quite an unfortunate success because it allows us now to look back on the operation and say, well, it ended up being really successful, so it wasn't that bad. But that sets a very dangerous precedent because you can't use the ends to justify the means. And I basically concluded that Operation Paperclip, although it was successful, illustrates one of the earlier times where the government ignored all morals and set a very dangerous precedent for the future.
Hi, I'm Moderator Riley. I did my work on the Office of Strategic Services in World War II. And I found a lot about how the war really wouldn't have been able to be won without a lot of the work that they did, which was kept classified until long after the war. The Office of Strategic Services used a lot of espionage, and they were able to establish relations with both programs in allied countries and allied nations, but also a lot of resistance movements, including ones in Germany. They also established a lot of new technology, including wireless radio transmitters that were able to transmit information without being detected, so spies could use it while in enemy nations. They also created the Compound 1 and Compound 2, which was the start of what is now the C4, which is used in war very often. It also was the starting base of the CIA, which we have now, which is very, very influential in our country today. So it started a large precedent of gathering foreign intelligence in a different way that we hadn't had before the war. They also had many
different operations with Jedburgh teams, which consisted of very, very small teams with both American agents and also agents from other allied nations that they were able to communicate with and use to their benefit to establish the best, basically, espionage missions to gather intelligence.
My name is Aria Bose, and I did my research on James K. Polk, who was the 11th President of the United States, and he served between 1845 and 1849. And I think he's a very overlooked president, and his accomplishments aren't talked about as much as they should be, especially since he increased the American land holdings by 38%. So my thesis was that although he used very aggressive policies in his expansionist endeavors, these aggressive policies embodied American sentiment at the time. So I focus on the three main expansionist projects that he did, which were Texas, Oregon, and into Mexico. So first with Texas, he was very aggressive as he bypassed a legislative measure by trying to do a joint occupation agreement with Mexico to acquire the Texas territory instead of trying to ratify a treaty, since that would only require half of the House to vote for it, as opposed to a treaty which would require a 2/3 majority. And also, regarding Texas, he failed to communicate many of his directions and decisions that he made, which were vital to the annexation process to Congress. So he left the legislative branch of the government in the dark very often. And for Oregon, he was aggressive as he almost pushed the issue of acquiring Oregon to war, because there was the British minister to the United States wrote a very aggressive and rude email to the president when he tried to negotiate a treaty that would give all of Oregon to the United States. So in response, Polk used this to his advantage and denied going on with negotiations until the British would give them what they wanted, and he likely would have continued with this arbitration if it weren't for the beginning of the Mexican-American War at the same time. So he settled for just half of Oregon, but he was still seen as a hero as he brought new land to the United States. And for Mexico, he was especially aggressive since he wanted land from the beginning, so he was looking for reasons to start a war. So the boundary between the United States and Mexico in the Texas region had always been disputed, as the United States wanted the boundary to be the Rio Grande, which was more to the south and to the west, while Mexico wanted the boundary to be the Nueces River, which was more north and east. So when American troops were attacked in the region between the two rivers, President Polk saw this as an attack on American soil, and he famously cried as a call of the spilling of American blood upon American soil, even though the land was still disputed. So he essentially started a war himself and acted as if the U.S. was already in a state of war before the war had officially started. And while these actions may seem aggressive in hindsight, they were actually very much supported at the time. And due to the manifest destiny sentiment that most Americans carried. And this manifest destiny sentiment was based on very shaky logic and religious appeal, but it was still the major sentiment of the time. And so I think that my claim is that even though Polk's policies and his expansion was very aggressive and likely would not slide today, at the time he was just doing what the American people wanted, and he believed that the ends did justify the means, and since he acquired the land, it shouldn't matter honor what he did to get it, even if it was through immoral practices.
So my question to the group, first question I had is, is U.S. national interest antithetical to morality? Can we have national interest for foreign policy and have morality at the same time, or are those two notions antithetical to each other?
I believe that to a degree they are antithetical. For example, the invasion of Iraq, while it may potentially have benefited the country from a political and geographical standpoint, it was a moral disaster that led to the death of hundreds of thousands, an undermining of U.S. trust, and was effectively one of the greatest catastrophes of the U.S. in the 21st century. But on the other hand, you have policies like the Marshall Plan, which is unrelated to my topic, but it lifted Europe out of poverty while greatly improving U.S. strategic position. The morality and U.S. political interests are often antithetical, but they're also often not, and it really comes down to a balancing act.
I agree with Oliver. I think that what the government's doing in private and what they're showing to the public often differ. As can be seen in Operation Paperclip, they were publicly condemning the Nazis for their treatment of Jews and World War II in general, but privately they were doing things very similar to what the Nazis were doing. And this was to serve their own interest in gaining an edge over the Soviets. So I think that the fact that the world is moving so fast, and once World War II ended, the US had another enemy pop up right away, means that they couldn't spend time in that position of like scrutinizing the Nazis because they had to move on and they had to focus on their new interest, which was winning the Cold War. So I think that they can't really coexist for very long just because of the pace of the world.
Yeah, add something similar to what Oliver said, except this relates to the nuclear bomb. A lot of people think that using a nuclear bomb was immoral and unjust. However, what I got out in my research was that it actually it could potentially saved thousands or even millions of lives. Because if you take a look at how many people died in the invasion of Normandy, estimates place it at 550,000 people died during that invasion. And the best estimates for the number of deaths during the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki place it at 200,000 deaths. So it's less than half of the number of people that died during the invasion of Normandy. Now, if we compare we say that hypothetically the United States had conducted a more conventional invasion of Japan, it's possible that hundreds of thousands or even millions of people would have died and the war would have extended for months or even years. So by dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States effectively ended the war as quickly as it could.
I also think that part of the problem is that oftentimes these national policies are formed by people that have somewhat immoral positions, and what I sort of found is that I found a parallel between like our modern climate towards immigration compared to the climate during the Red Scare, and policies towards immigration can be drawn to, like in our modern state, can be drawn to immoral positions that continue to oppress immigrants to this day. So therefore I think it's very hard for national policies to be progressive when the people in power and the people that are making them have motives that don't support progressive stances.
Questions from the audience?
Scarlett, how did you come to hear about Operation Paperclip? That was fascinating.
Well, it started because my brother mentioned this other operation that had to do with the mafia and how they actually helped the U.S. in World War II. And I started to write a paper on that, but then I couldn't really find enough evidence to write a full 7-page paper. So I after that, I knew that I wanted to do some like declassified mission from the government. So I just looked up a list of them and I found Operation Paperclip. And I find it very interesting to look at these declassified files because it really goes to show that you don't know what the government's doing at all. Like right now, they're all classified. In the future, we can look back and be like, oh, we were doing that right now. But as much as I would like to be a fly on the wall in the Oval Office, I can't. So I wanted to look to the past.
I have a question, Chris. Yeah, a lot of this it's just so impressive, like I said before, the depth and the interest. Does this then translate as you move on from Irvington High School to, or even now currently, into action? Are there things that you think about doing to counteract all these obvious problems and issues which some have said are cyclical, just keep going through the same process of systemic racism or whatever it is? Do you see yourselves as kind of jumping in and being part of a movement or a group or somebody that takes that on, what you've described and what you've done research on? That's a question.
I think my research definitely has sparked an interest in immigration activism and immigration law, and that's also sort of what inspired me to dive into this topic. So I definitely think that knowing more about these types of issues can help you to pursue a career or activism that helps to fight against these issues.
Great answer.
I'm going to throw out one more question that's a little simpler than Dr. Lowe's question. Maybe not easier, but simpler. Does U.S. foreign policy do more harm than good?
I think in the case of my paper, it definitely did more harm than good, because the whole reason for expansion was just because of American ethnocentrism and nationalism. Like, people in America believed that they had the right to these Western lands, but they didn't really have, they could have done just as good with the lands that they already have. And I think with the expansion, all it did was create more problems for the future. For example, with slavery, the huge Mexican cession in the West really sparked a debate about the power of slave states, as Northern Whigs really opposed slavery since they thought it would disproportionately increase the power of the South in government. So, and that all obviously led to the Civil War later in the future. So I think it would cause a lot more problems than it solved.
I would definitely say that for my paper, I think that foreign policy did more harm than good. I would say that scientists, the top scientists in America, such as J. Robert Oppenheimer, advocated that nuclear secrets should have been spread to the Soviet Union to promote greater peace and global cooperation and limit the number of atomic bombs in the world. Despite these opinions, Presidents Roosevelt and Truman opted to not share the secrets with the Soviet Union, creating further tension between the two countries and driving the world into the Cold War, which lasted 50 years.
I'd say for mine, it's almost impossible to say because a lot of supporters of Operation Paperclip claim that if the U.S. hadn't done it, the Soviets would have, which is true because the Soviets had a parallel operation, starting with an O, but I can't pronounce it. And they were doing the exact same thing we were doing, which doesn't really justify it or make it right. But had we not been as successful in recruiting German scientists, the Cold War could have completely tilted in the favor of the Soviets.
For my topic in specific, like many of the others, U.S. foreign policy did more harm than good. But I believe that as a whole, U.S. foreign policy, if nothing else, has the potential to do immense good in the world. As, for example, the U.S. fought against the Nazis, funded AIDS treatments in Africa. But while there's also the potential for catastrophes like the Iraq War or Operation Paperclip that are just morally wrong, U.S. foreign policy has the opportunity to do tremendous good, especially considering that it is one of the only major powers that is a democracy, or the major power that is a democracy.
For my topic, a lot of the missions that the OSS did are still classified to this day. But I think overall, I think someone said earlier that it was a balancing act. And I think that's really true because on one hand, it seems that the work they did in the system that they established of gathering intelligence and the weapons that they created were very, very beneficial in World War II and in the future. But a lot of their missions did cause a lot of damage to the nations that they did them in and to a lot of people. So I think I agree that they have both harm and good, and it's kind of hard to establish a line in them.
I mean, first off, like, really great job to everyone. Like, the thing that I liked the most while listening to everyone was just the fact that, like, all of these foreign policies were so, like, varied in the types of issues they were trying to address. And obviously, like, history is here for us to learn from, like, whether it be from, like, the Manhattan Project or from, like, territorial expansion. So even though you guys did all these topics, if you guys could choose one word to guide the principle on which our future foreign policy should be enacted, just one word, what would it be?
I would choose the word cooperation because we exist in a world in many other countries. We're not people who need power. We have to cooperate with other countries to promote a more peaceful and fair world.
I would say effective because the U.S. is going to do whatever they want to do, the government, and so it might as well work.
I would say cautious because while the U.S. has the potential for incredible good, it also has the potential to create complete catastrophes, which is one of the downsides that comes with being the most powerful nation in the world. And while many of the great successes have been the U.S. policy, many of the failures have just been due to acting recklessly and with incredible power.
I would say supportive so that the people that could one day help make our society and our country a better place could have the means to do so.
I'll say based on the general consensus of the public because I think the job of the government is to appeal to the what the nation is feeling at that moment.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Sam.
I was just wondering if you think these secret really gray kind of American missions are strictly limited to America, or do you think other countries do the same thing? And is it because the American values play a role in these missions, or is it kind of
As I mentioned earlier, the Soviets were doing the exact same thing, and many other major European powers were doing the same thing following the end of World War II. So I think that just goes to show that we can criticize our foreign policy, but we also have to turn it around and look at other countries. And I think that our American ideals do play a role in how the government presents these operations or whatever they're doing to the public, because we sort of hid it. We didn't want our people knowing what we were doing because we are supposed to be this great democratic nation. Whereas, I don't know what the Soviets were doing, but they might have acted differently because they wanted to portray their country in a different way.
I would also say that one important factor to consider is that the U.S., in terms of American values, the U.S. answers to the people above, or in theory at least, above all else. And that is reflected in how, for example, the Vietnam War led to Lyndon Johnson's pretty much being just stained forever. And whereas with the Soviet Union, they really have no one to answer to but themselves. So so I think American values do play a part in potentially limiting operations such as that.
I feel the need to chime in to Scarlett's answer. Scarlett, you're reminding me of my late beloved father-in-law, who was a brilliant physicist for Grumman, and had a couple hundred patents, especially in optics. And when my wife would ask him, how do you feel about your role in developing these weapon systems? And his answer was always, if I wouldn't do it, someone else would do it on the other side, and it may not be always justifiable, but better us in the context of the world. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Any other questions on this panel?
This might be a little off topic, but this is for you, Nate. First of all, I love the paper. I was really interested in your talks about expansion, and I was wondering if you had thought about any potential colonization on the moon and like when that would be.
Well, the plan for Artemis, like the next Artemis mission is 2026, so that's probably going to be pushed back, and the American plans aren't tremendously detailed, unlike the Chinese plans. Like, well, one of the, I think in terms of American foreign policy, just how we portray ourselves to nations in terms of acting as an example of what a modern technological power looks like, that has actually, in some ways, inspired other nations to kind of live up to that standard. Like that's part of the reason why China decided to do all of these space missions in the first place. And they have done impressive work because they want to one-up us. So I don't think competition is necessarily inherently a bad thing. Like but if you're competing for war, that's bad. But if you are competing for, say, ascending to the stars, then that's a very good thing.
Yeah, another question. Why do you think that space exploration and expansion would be like more of a unifying factor for the American people over like you mentioned, environmentalism? Like I feel like since we're living on this planet, we would all want to like fight to keep it around and like we're living here. So yeah, it's like better our conditions here than in other places.
Well, it has to be portrayed in the right way. I think there's this notion among a lot of American people where, space exploration is just the selfish rich people going away, leaving Earth behind. But if we were to market it as more specifically going to the moon to save Earth, to develop the technologies, the renewable, like I mentioned fusion power before, but also we can get resources from the moon, mine it, and transport that back to Earth so as to lessen the burden on Earth, because the moon's already dead. We don't have to worry about killing ecosystems of the moon. And I know that sounds really expensive, but launching from the moon is much easier than launching from Earth because of low gravity. And once you have a large presence on the moon, you don't really have to launch there too much. You just focus on sending it back, have some kind of very cheap technological thing for letting the ocean collect it. It's yours.
All right, let's give it up for our second. And come this way, and Mr. Hirsch will give you your certificate. Thanks, everybody. Nice work, Our third panel can come on up. So our third group is a little bit of a mishmash. Obviously, when we try to come up with panel topics, you can see the rich array and diversity of topics Doesn't always lend itself to a compact panel, but this panel we're calling it the convergence of culture and American history. Again, you'll see within this panel there's a lot of diversity of topics.
My name is Samuel Andrade, and my paper focused on a political cartoonist named Thomas Nast, who had made political cartoons in the mid to late 1800s. And basically the main takeaway from my research was that Thomas Nast was very significant in the development of the political cartoon, and I would say that he essentially revolutionized the political cartoon, and I don't know how relevant political cartoons are today, but I'd say that in the 1900s and maybe early 2000s, they're definitely very relevant, and the book I used for most of my research even called him the father of the modern political cartoon, and most of my research just consists of how his significance throughout the different time periods he was in. For example, he had a lot of influence during the Civil War era, where he essentially revolutionized political cartoons by creating these cartoons known as sentimental cartoons, which kind of appealed to people's emotions, and it kind of changed the way these cartoons were used, because I also talked about in the past how the political cartoons started. They were relatively simple back then, and they were kind of just based on what was going on at the time in the U.S., but he kind of changed how it reached out to different people, and I think one of the most interesting things I learned, and probably the thing he is most known for, I think, is how he helped in taking down someone called Boss Tweed, who was a very corrupt politician who controlled a political machine in the Gilded Age, as it's called. And basically through his cartoons, Boss Tweed tried to escape to another country, but his cartoons helped in taking him down, and it kind of shows how his cartoons, the significance of the cartoons, and how important he was in general.
My name is Benjamin Beyer, and in my paper, I discussed oppressed peoples in silent film and the commercialization of American prejudice. Specifically, I discussed Native Americans, Black Americans, women, and Italian Americans. Now, for Native Americans specifically, they were often depicted as lesser people, as underdeveloped. And just to give you one example, a D.W. Griffith film by the name of The Battle of Bush Gulch. This was a half-hour film that depicted a white family with two cute little puppies that a group of Native Americans attempted to eat. This was one of just many depictions of Native Americans being savage and generally just depicting them in racist ways, and this had far-reaching effects, including modern-day Native Americans some of which base their understanding of their people's history on these films, these records of their history, as real Native American actors were used in these films, and creates misunderstanding among current-day Native Americans of their own history. And secondly, for Black Americans, one major example of a film would have been a more well-known D.W. Griffith film, the first feature-length American film, Birth of a Nation. And this film took place during the Civil War and Reconstruction, and it depicted Black Americans using some Black American actors and some white Americans in blackface. It depicted Black Americans as enjoying slavery, which was wrong in a number of ways, as I'm sure we now understand, people in the 1920s may not have. And additionally, they were depicted in obviously racist ways. They were modern stereotypes, such as association between Black Americans and fried chicken, were displayed in this film for no apparent reason other than the purpose of spreading stereotypes. And this appealed to American audiences as this was their belief at the time for many white Americans. This was how they saw other peoples,
And this was what they wanted to see. They didn't want their beliefs to be challenged. They wouldn't pay for that. And at the end of the day, film was an industry that made money. For women, they were often sexualized in film and included for their beauty more than for their acting abilities. One woman by the name of Clara Bow, she was described as, and I quote, the hottest jazz baby in films to promote her 1925 film, The Plastic Age. And as you can hear, there wasn't a single mention of her acting ability, only her looks within this description. They didn't sell these films based on women's acting abilities, only their looks. That was what male audiences wanted to see, and that was what sold. Lastly, for Italian Americans, they were viewed as, typically Northern Italians with lighter skin were viewed as salvageable due to their lighter skin, and thus they were depicted as just a funny people for comedic effect with weird practices that could be Americanized as they were assimilated. They were not at all respected as well as their cultural customs. And during World War I, this worsened as they were depicted as a radical group that as xenophobia increased with war, they were depicted in much more unsavory ways. All in all, this prejudice sells. This is what people wanted to see, and this is what they were willing to pay for. And I'd argue that our capitalist system, as it in the 1920s and today, creates an increasing wealth gap and gives the ability to create this art to the people with the most money. This generates prejudice in American society. And as the most comparable technology to film in the 1920s would be AI today. And as we spot prejudice occurring in the development of these modern technologies, it's our job as Americans and as human beings to stamp it out like a messed up game of whack-a-mole, and to really ensure for our fellow human beings that we can, that another kid in 100 years doesn't write an essay about how AI was negative, had the negative influence on American culture in the 2020s.
My name is Tane Kim, and while I was sitting in the crowd, I couldn't help but notice these amazing paintings that we have displayed here, Irvington student art. And I think it's clear just from the room that we're in that art defines us, art surrounds us in many ways. And I even want to look past just these posters, even the craftsmanship of this wood and the architecture of this room. It's all a form of art. And since the beginning of human history, art has not only defined human expression and our ability to communicate our thoughts and our innermost passions, but as Ben said, it's kind of a hallmark of what society's values are during any specific time period. And my paper strove to delve into that topic and how in the intersection of technology and art, there has always been recurring patterns throughout history. Firstly, people have always denied that technology counts as a form of art. Secondly, they've learned to accept it. They've begun to integrate that technology into existing forms of art to create often surprising new forms of art. Think photography, which led to the advent of filmmaking. And then lastly, the intersections of technology and art almost always lead to some sort of counterculture, a cultural revolution, in which the traditions of art are re-sparked in a modern age. Now, my paper explores the modern day implications of this idea by delving into past examples of the US and its long charted history of art, and then connecting this history to the modern day example of AI, as Ben actually mentioned. I found that upon closer analysis, the modern day trend of AI actually corresponds very closely to this pattern that I mentioned before. We're at the stage in society where actually AI is in the very fledgling stages of being integrated into existing art forms like filmmaking, animation, architecture. But there is a lot of pushback from traditional artists. And the conclusion that I reached is that
Against the current backdrop of advancing AI technology, cultivating a creatively vital populace, which emphasizes the individuality of every unique human voice, is essential to preserving our artistic integrity in a digital age where AI technology, where honestly the boundaries between AI technology and our own writing and paintings are being blurred by the day. So within this current society, I've just concluded that it's super important for us to essentially undergo a 21st century renaissance. And my paper explores the policies that we could implement, how we could implement such renaissance within education systems, ultimately for the goal of preserving our God-given right to self-expression and finding purpose and dignity within ourselves, facing our collective future with undiluted courage.
Hi, my name is Samantha Tillman, and my essay was titled Not in My House, an analysis on the cultural influence and theft of ballroom culture. So I researched about how Black queer people created a vibrant subculture that ended up being appropriated by the very people who oppressed them. So after slavery ended, many Black Americans moved to New York City and kind of created their own local safe spaces for them. But the Black queer Americans inside those cities, including New York, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., were outcast from their communities. And they were also outcast from the mainstream gay community, often being segregated from gay bars and just not really allowed entrance into either form of community. So they ended up creating their own culture, and this is ballroom culture. Separated into houses was like the main form of this, where many people would be in their own little families because they had no true families after being kicked out of their homes. They had house mothers, which were false mothers that helped guide young kids through the real world and also through the world of ballroom, which was kind of an elaborate like party, like mocking real like balls, and performers would walk across like dance floors, kind of mimicking model poses and like as if they were walking a runway, often stealing clothes and creating their own costumes, really creating like a mimicry of the gender performances. And this was broken down into a lot of different ideas like dance, where they created voguing, and also all sorts of other makeup trends and new ideas, and also slang. So all like slang, dance, music, such as like bounce music and house music, were all kind of developed inside ballroom culture, and then eventually appropriated and kind of stolen from these people. So I kind of explored in my topic all about these different ideas and more specific examples. For example, there's a 1990 documentary called Paris is Burning, which seeks to explore ballroom culture, but kind of fails at actually delving into the topic. It was super popular and it was probably the most famous film on the culture, except it doesn't mention the AIDS pandemic or any sort of actual relevance of the topic. And it's kind of a featureless film that ended up actually not paying the workers who were in the film. So it's just another example of how ballroom culture is kind of stolen. In Madonna's Vogue music video, she hired many dancers, except those dancers were also not paid as much as they should have been. And sort of this stealing has kind of been ongoing, especially today. Modern day slang and all sorts of words from ballroom culture are kind of stolen and then reappropriated, eventually used by corporations and kind of just taken away from original people who created their own safe space. And I kind of researched about how this idea of oppressed people creating their own safe space is often taken away by their own oppressors and eventually reappropriated into nothing, leading those people to create other safe spaces.
Hello, my name is Rugalazia, and my paper was titled Unlocking the Code, How Social Media is Dismantling American Democracy. And it kind of centered around three things, which was the amplification of extreme viewpoints, echo chambers, as well as the diminishing of public discourse. And I think that a lot of times when we think of social media, we think of, well, I mean, for the parents think of like the corruption of their children. But we think of the opening up of public speech and giving opportunities to these new perspectives to kind of be put out into the world and be received on a larger scale. But I think we often forget that these corporations that create these social media apps like TikTok or Facebook, Instagram, they're also businesses. So when we receive this media, oftentimes, which is what an echo chamber is, we'll receive media that we're going to like, that we will want to interact with, that will kind of trigger our emotional responses, and they want to make money off of us, basically, essentially is what they're doing. And we're kind of receiving these biased articles, like confirmation bias, that keep telling us that what we're thinking is correct. And we're kind of stuck in these circles that we can't get out of, these bubbles that are telling us that we're always correct. And the product of this is diminishing of public discourse. Right? We have a generation of children who really can't have these open conversations with each other. They kind of shut down at opposition to their viewpoints, and when they see something, that they hear something that seems to kind of go against their beliefs, they feel very attacked personally because they're not used to hearing things that really don't align with their values. Also, social media awards politicians who use language that kind of is very extreme because it invokes this reaction in the public and has them repost the post that they're doing, or share it with their friends. And the more extreme and radical our politicians are, the more likely they are to have bigger control over the population and have bigger influence in the younger generations, essentially. It's really hurting our democratic vitality because it's diminishing our ability to speak with each other and empathize with each other and understand where we're coming from. If you think about it, only 8% of what the average person sees on social media it's only representative of only 8% of what's actually going on in our political parties, and so we're receiving a very biased and limited view that's taking away from our progress and advancing forward. Oh, and Sam, I know that you mentioned political cartoons and how maybe they're not relevant anymore, but I think that if you moved from newspapers to social media, and we still have a very big illiterate population that uses these cartoons and these pictures to kind of understand politics in the modern day, so research is still very relevant and very important.
My name is Charlotte Fuchs, and my paper is called American English, the History of a Misunderstood Dialect. And it is about the history of American English as its own unique dialect and how it developed differently from British English. I don't think many people realize how integral the language we speak is to the culture that we live in, and I think you can see this when bilingual people tell you that they have different personalities in the different languages that they speak in. So I think it's very important to know how our languages developed. So in American English, a lot of it has to do with influences from other languages, whether via colonization or immigration. And I think in a way it represents the ideal version of America as a place of everybody from all cultures to integrate and influence culture. And even if that does not happen the way we wish it would, I think that American English is the ideal version of this. A lot of what I talked about in my paper was about specifically the influence of Yiddish, which is an Ashkenazi Jewish language that has had, I think, a lot of influence that people outside of the Jewish community don't really realize, and how how American English was changed intentionally by the colonial Americans as resistance to the oppression of the British government, and how language can be used as resistance and protest.
So, Charlotte, I have a question similar to Mr. Hirsch's earlier question. Where did you get your interest in the English language such that you would be willing to spend weeks working on a 7-page paper?
I've been interested in writing all my life, so I think that I want to know more about just the very
like stepping stones of what writing is and what my personal writing is, because of course I speak American English. And back to what I said earlier when I was talking about Yiddish, I am an Ashkenazi Jew, and so I also wanted to talk a lot about that and how that has influenced the language.
So here's my question to the panel. It's kind of a chicken and egg question, and I apologize if it comes out too simplistically. Does art create U.S. culture, or does art reflect U.S. culture?
Well, I think that art creates culture, not just in the U.S., but I think that the process of creating art is the process of creating culture, and that when you create art, you're not just reflecting yourself on the page. I don't know if any of you here are artists, or I'm personally not an artist, but I'm a poet. So I know that just from the experience of writing a poem, you're not really reflecting your thoughts on the paper. As you write every word, you're really sculpting your own identity, and you're finding yourself as you write. So it's not really about art reflecting the culture, it's about the expression, the act of art, allowing people to discover what they truly think about certain topics. So yeah, I think that art comes first and then the culture.
I really agree. I think it's, or at least about how art allows people to say things. And I think even within this topic earlier about how Hawaiians took back their culture with art, music, that's another example. But I know in this example, ballroom is really a way for people to be able to express themselves and also kind of express their discontent in society and kind of also find a way to blend into the society with makeup and fashion, both with like a rich upper class society and also the general like heterosexual society. And I think art, it really is both a critique and it influences culture.
I totally agree. I mean, social media, the things that go viral on TikTok, for example, they become the language we use all over the country. It spreads so fast, and it's so kind of wide reach that really, like, those 15-second clips that you see on TikTok, those might not be the art that we like consider, like, when we think of art, like more paintings or drawings or music, right? But these short, like, reels or TikToks are also a form of art and a form of expression, and they really become the slang that we use. They become how we interact with people on a daily basis. And I'm sure we can all think of like things we say every single day that have really come from social media platforms that have become part of who we are. So I really do think that art becomes the culture, especially with technology. It spreads really fast and has more reach.
I think I mainly agree with what everybody's been saying. However, if you consider in like language to be an art, which I sort of do what Tane said about when he said he wasn't an artist, he's a poet. I do think that poetry is art, but with American, with American English, the way it developed was as a protest to reflect American culture, and then words that were created by people like Merriam-Webster ended up forming American culture. Like the word presidential was popularized by Webster, and which is definitely reflected on us today, because just look at us. Sorry.
Yeah, I also agree with everyone else, but I would say that my point of view is that art would reflect culture, at least in my case, because the political cartoons that Thomas Nast made weren't really meant to create much culture, at least I think, because they were kind of reflecting what's happening as society in that moment. And I think it's very important that art does reflect culture, because we can kind of shed light on what is happening. And definitely in Nast's case, his political cartoons during Reconstruction were very important because they reflected a more radical point of view of American culture that kind of championed Black rights and supported the idea during a time that came after the Civil War where there's a lot of disarray and confusion over Black rights and other groups.
I agree with Sam. I would say, in the case of my research as well, the culture, the art was created by the culture. And this is specifically for film in the 1920s, which was a very new industry as well as an art form. And because it was such a new industry, the technology was still very expensive. Those with the most money had the power to create the film. And when we give the power to create art only to those with the most money, when we let money drive our art, then it will always reflect what people want to see rather than what they need to see. It will reflect what people are already saying rather than what they should be saying. People's beliefs will be reflected rather than challenged, and it will only reflect what people want to see in our society. So in a case like mine, I'd say definitely the culture has created, the art was created by the culture. However, in a more modern day where we don't just have, where cameras, we have a camera right there, we have a camera right here, we all have the power to create film, and thus film is much more driven by the culture. The culture is much more driven by film today, as more people have the power to create it.
I have a question for Ben. First of all, I really liked your paper on the topic. Second of all, I happen to be reading Gone with the Wind right now, which is like, in Gone with the Wind, slaves are portrayed as really enjoying their role as slaves and being like prideful in serving their masters, which is obviously not accurate to our understanding of slavery now. And that reminded me of what you mentioned about racism in these silent films. So I'm wondering how you feel. Do you think that we should still be consuming these racist medias through a historical lens to learn about like the perspectives back then, or do you think that we should set those aside and focus our consumption more on more equal or media or more modern media?
That's a tough question. I watched through all 3 hours of Birth of a Nation, and I regret it in a lot of ways. But, the film was very racist. I mentioned it showed Black Americans as enjoying slavery, and then in the aftermath of slavery and Reconstruction, it showed them as being almost corrupted by the few rights they were given. And this made me upset to watch. And I do believe it's important to be upset by what we watch, watching to challenge our beliefs. But when we see art such as this, where it antagonizes our fellow human beings and glorifies the Ku Klux Klan in disturbing ways, it's important to watch art to consume art that challenges our beliefs. But at the same time, I believe it's important to use a strong historical lens and use the perspectives of other people with more equal views today, as if we let the views of somebody as of a white supremacist like D.W. Griffith, if we let his views drive our society the same way it drove society back in the 1920s, it could only spell disaster for our fellow Americans.
Sophia, I liked your talk. Question to start with you, but I'm curious about the others. This is a generational question. Is personal expression on social media art?
Totally. We had our AP Lang question on this. We had it about whether selfies were art, a form of art, like an expression, and I think totally. I think it's just an extension of ourselves. I think it has horrible negative effects on our mental health? Yes, for sure. I regret the amount of time I put on social media every single day. I don't think there's a day that goes by where I don't absolutely despise it. But on the other hand, it's just so important for us to understand what's going on with each other and kind of to create this culture, because without social media we become completely different people. Even our language on a day-to-day basis, we get that from social media, and so I would not know who I was if I didn't have any contact with it. But I totally think that it's art, and I think that all of us as human beings, we are walking art, and so our personalities and what we say and what we think are all kind of part of that, and so social media as being part of our culture and who we are definitely plays a big part in self-expression.
have a question, Sophie, also, and I had written it down, and then Ben, you just kind of reinforced my thinking when you talked about people getting what they want instead of what they need in terms of art. So first of all, Sophie, I just want to say thank you for helping me to understand social media much better than I did before. But given your grim conclusion to that, my question is there any hope, is there another model, whether it be socialism or government regulation, or is there some way to make social media something more than just TikTok making money or Meta making money with all the negative consequences that we talked about that has? Is there anything we can do to like steer in a direction that it's not so destructive?
It's definitely like a very intense question. I have to say no. I think that if you start regulating social media, I think you start taking away from free speech. I think that it's very hard to put restrictions on what people can say, what they do, and there is a way maybe to program a new type of media that maybe is better for us, but I think even if it's in the hands of the government, there's still going to be some kind of bias at play. I think it's naive to think that there will ever be social media without any influence from like what the higher up people want, what the with power want. I think it's important to just be aware of it. I think it's important to teach it, and before you give your children like access to it, to make sure that they understand it and reinforce these messages to them, to kind of understand their maturity and their understanding of social media, because it's so dangerous, but it's so imperative to how we live our every single day of like our lives. But I think that it's important to like disconnect sometimes, just be aware. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe there's hope.
Thanks. Any other questions for our third panel?
So when I look at my crystal ball and make this prediction, this is not the last research project that you're going to complete, right? You guys are scholars, you're going to a period of time with the scholars. So having gone through this process, what's your takeaway about research in general? What do you like? How are you trained as researchers going forward?
I'd say, I'd say that with my experience, I mentioned that film in the 1920s is comparable to AI today, and how we need to find these emerging examples of prejudice in our technology and our art forms and stamp them out. And I'd say that when we look at the modern day as a technology as unprecedented as artificial intelligence, there's so many questions about what to do, what the government should do, what we should do with it. And I'd say that the best way to guide our decisions is to understand the past, to research, to know what people in the past have done, the consequences of their actions, and what they could have done better. There's no better way to guide our future than by looking to the past. And in order to protect fellow human beings from prejudice and really disaster at the hands of art driven by prejudice, we need to look to history and ensure that we don't make the same mistakes. I learned two, I'd say, really important things. That one, it's definitely a skill to be able to like get rid of some of the parts of the essay. I had to cut this down by a lot of pages, and there was like so much information I wanted to add, but I think it's really interesting and educational for me to be able to decide what's like the real most important parts of the essay. And I also thought research can be really like obviously educational, but also like emotionally educational in a way where it's like, what can connect to my own personal life, and what can I teach other people around me that they wouldn't know. I'm like me, and I know family and my friends have all heard about this from me for weeks, but I really learned a lot, and I think they did too. So.
I agree. As a student in the science research program, I found this to be very different from science research. It's like the experience of like looking for the articles and kind of finding what I wanted to do is similar, but this challenged what I knew more than like science research where I'm looking for new things. This kind of challenged my own beliefs and my own like behaviors with technology and social media. So I think that this had a much more emotional impact on me, and it kind of was harder to write because I'm figuring out where I stood on like more moral issues, because I think history is often intertwined with deep moral like problems that you need to kind of question yourself first before you can write down on paper.
I learned that if you find something that you're truly interested in, then the work that you do will feel much less like a drag, and it'll be much easier to do, and your product will be much better in the long run.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone said. I thought it was a super rewarding experience, and honestly, like, the process of researching this, it was like a month ago. I have short-term memory loss, so it's like kind of foggy already for me, but I know that like coming here today, and like I thought I knew a lot about art. I thought I knew what art even was, but it seems like there's still so many like valid viewpoints that I've yet to explore, and I think that the fact that everyone chose a very similar, I mean like art-related topic, but the fact that we all had so many different interpretations of like even the same questions, it kind of opened my eyes to like how much there still is to learn.
I think we're very privileged to have the opportunity in the school to like kind of pursue our own interests in ways that maybe other people don't get to. So thank you, Mr. Berry, and thank you, Mr. Fata, for letting us do this.
And I just want to add one last thing. For me, I think this research, especially because I did on something that's kind of more focused towards the past, compared to something like art and AI. Well, I guess they didn't focus on AI, but they focused on social media and how it relates to today. But for me, I kind of learned how important it is to actively find primary sources and kind of try to interpret them for yourself, and maybe not just, you should also use secondary sources to kind of aid your analysis, but I think when looking at something like a political cartoon, trying to analyze it without any other additional information is very important, because it can kind of, it's very important to look at history without being impacted by things today, and you can see how continuity and change has changed over time, and it's especially important in things like art and other stuff like film and just influences in general.
How about this for the third time?
Okay, folks, before they get their papers, Veronica, I'd like you, if you'd like to say a few words to conclude the program. Please.
Good. I didn't expect to see history about stuff that was when we were at age, modern stuff. Wait, my legs are wrong.
Students, thank you all for such impressive work. It was incredible. And thank you, Mr. Barry, Dr. Mosenthal, for being a guide for all of this impressive work that the students put forth. I don't know what your futures where your futures will take you. I'm assuming you'll continue to study history, and some of you may even be history majors, who knows? But whichever path your future takes you to, we wish you the best of luck. And what I want to mention, excuse me, is that the Historical Society has an open door for you all, students, teachers, and parents. However, we can be a platform for your work, a partner for any projects you have, or a resource of information. Let us know. You can contact me, Veronica Gedrich, or Dr. Mosenthal, and our website is a good way to reach out. That's irvingtonhistoricalsociety.org. Thank you so much.